Welcome everyone to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the mind-bending reality of the government's newly released UAP files and investigative filmmaker Jeremy Corbell's relentless fight for transparency. Recently, the government orchestrated its very first actual drop of alien files. But, according to Corbell, what was released might just be a carefully managed smokescreen for what's really being hidden. We're going to break down the timeline, the evidence, and the incredible pushback from journalists who just absolutely refuse to be silenced. Okay, so just imagine for a second standing on the moon and seeing this. Jeremy Corbell uses a super visceral thought experiment to react to actual visual data from our own space program that has left researchers scratching their heads for decades. He says, I can imagine if I were one of the astronauts standing on the moon that day and suddenly there's something that appears to be a spacecraft floating above the moon, I would freak out. And you know, this isn't just some fun hypothetical. It's a direct reaction to some very real, very puzzling historical anomalies.
Which brings us to Section 1, the Apollo 17 anomaly.
We're starting our journey with the very last lunar landing mission, because what was caught on camera that day truly sets the stage for the whole shebang. If you look closely at this historical photograph, you can clearly see the shadow of the lunar landing craft right there on the moon's surface. But up in the distant sky, there are three distinct, completely unidentified dots hovering. It's an anomaly that completely defies conventional explanation. Corbell highlights this image because it points to a much larger, decades-old mystery. It really makes us stop and ask, what exactly have our highly trained astronauts been witnessing out there in the vacuum of space? And look, we're not just talking about wild, fringe theories here. We're talking about respected, highly credentialed folks like Dr. Edgar Mitchell. He was literally the sixth man to ever walk on the moon. In Corbell's new documentary Sleeping Dog, he conducts his final interview with Dr. Mitchell, who actually had a tremendous amount to say, openly confirming his belief in the UAP reality. When the men who have physically stood on the lunar surface are telling us there's something more going on, well, it fundamentally shifts how we have to evaluate this entire subject, and it leads us straight into a modern-day vault of locked-away evidence. Moving right along to Section 2, the missing 46 videos. 46. That is the exact number of highly classified UAP videos the public has explicitly asked for. Out of this massive trove of visual data, investigative journalists Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp have only been able to leak and release 2 of them to the public so far. Just 2 out of 46. The gap between what the government is hoarding and what the public is actually allowed to see is frankly staggering. So right now, we're basically looking at 2 completely different approaches to disclosure. On one side, we have this slow drip, a really lukewarm, weekly release of files orchestrated by the White House and Representative Birtles. But on the other side, that's where the real prize is, the game-changing evidence. We're talking about those 46 withheld videos. Corbell and Knapp have actually been exposed to them, and they firmly believe releasing them would be an absolute game-changer that definitively proves the phenomenon. But instead, we're just getting this heavily managed, bureaucratic trickle. And man, if you think the concept of hidden videos is wild, consider the explosive testimony happening under oath in Congress. We've had Navy commanders and high-level whistleblowers like David Grush step forward. They aren't just talking about blurry lights in the sky anymore. Grush has testified that the government is withholding evidence of actual biologics, meaning the actual beings that pilot these crafts, and even autopsies of them. When you have top-tier intelligence officials talking about recovered non-human biologics under oath, it adds incredible weight to the questions surrounding these recent file drops. Which leads us to a massive underlying question. If the evidence is truly this groundbreaking, why on earth is the government burying the lead with a lukewarm, slow-burn release? Corbell suggests 2 main possibilities here. Either it's a slow, calculated acclimation to prevent the public from going into ontological shock upon learning we aren't alone. Or these programs are just so deeply compartmentalized and locked down that even a presidential order couldn't pry the truly good stuff loose for this file dump. Let's dig into that in Section 3, Motivations Behind the Secrecy. To really answer why this information is locked down so tight, we kind of have to look past the sensational idea of aliens and focus directly on the harsh geopolitical reality of human warfare and international competition. According to Corbell, there's a literal pipeline of secrecy driven by an old-school nuclear science mentality. Step 1, you recover a craft of unknown origin. Step 2, you exploit that craft, understand its derivative technologies. And Step 3, you weaponize that technology for a competitive advantage in warfare. That's the core sequence argued by the source material. It's not about hiding the truth to protect our feelings, It's about making absolutely sure your enemies don't get the technology first. The sources argue this secrecy stems entirely from the need for a competitive advantage in warfare. This is proposed as the primary reason UAP data is guarded more strictly than even weapons of mass destruction. The argument goes that this secrecy was put in place decades ago to ensure that advanced, derivative technologies, hardware that would literally make our current capabilities look obsolete, don't leak out to rival nations. From this perspective, it's basically a high-stakes global arms race centered entirely around reverse engineering unknown craft.
But, the narrative is shifting super rapidly. Think about it. 20 years ago, the public perception of anyone talking about UAPs was that they were crazy, wearing tinfoil hats, and just part of some fringe society. The government's stance was complete and utter denial. Today, it's considered a reality everyone needs to know about, and it's actively acknowledged by Congress, the White House, and the Department of Defense. Actually, scratch that. It's not just acknowledged, it's being actively discussed at the highest levels. This violent shift in reality is a direct testament to the relentless pushing by journalists to bring this into the mainstream.
And that perfectly sets up Section 4, the fight for transparency.
So how exactly are public pressure and relentless journalism finally forcing the government's hand after decades of silence? Well, the timeline of Corbell's new documentary, Sleeping Dog, maps exactly onto this fight. For the past 20 years, Corbo has been gathering footage, navigating a path filled with pushback and intense efforts to control his narrative. Today, the premiere of his documentary coincides perfectly with the government's first UAP file drop, a drop he argues was directly provoked by this relentless pressure. And moving forward, starting on the 12th, this comprehensive look at the fight for truth becomes widely available for streaming.
But Corbell is super clear about one thing. Sleeping Dog is about way more than just unseen footage. It's fundamentally about the First Amendment. It's about freedom of speech and freedom of thought. It argues for the public's absolute right to have access to this data set so we can actually understand our own reality. Most importantly, it serves as a rallying cry for the fundamental right to perform journalism in the face of immense government secrecy and intimidation.
Corbell actually issues a direct, pointed warning regarding those missing files. He says, if they don't release those 46 videos, I suspect journalism will do their job for them. He's making the case that if the government continues this slow, lukewarm disclosure just to appease the masses while hiding the true extent of the data, well, the media is fully prepared, equipped, and willing to force the issue and leak the information themselves.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, really provocative thought. If the government refuses to disclose the full truth, will journalistic provocation be the only way to finally force transparency? Now that the lid is at least slightly off this decades-old secret, the source material leaves us wondering who will ultimately deliver the remaining truth. Will it be the defense sector guarding its secrets, or the journalists fighting to expose them? It's a fascinating standoff for sure, and one we'll undoubtedly be watching very, very closely.